Okay, so there we go. That was, I hope, sufficiently monk sounding. That is actually Misty Mountains from The Hobbit film, but it does sound sufficiently religious. And this recording, followed by a live private discussion session, is entitled Saint Augustine and the Six Ages of the World. This is part of our Cycles of History, our Sons of Issachar class here at ApocatastasisInstitute. We're making our way over the weeks ahead through the different meditations on historical cycles. And so we are, in a sense, as we'll find out, starting at the beginning. Now, St. Augustine's writing in the 4th and 5th centuries. How on earth is at the beginning? Well, it's the beginning of historiography, which is the writing of history and the philosophy of history. We'll get into his groundbreaking Civitas Dei, his City of God. I hope everyone is ready and settled in here. I have a big-ass flagon of tea that's very hot, hence the towel. I hope you have some non-alcoholic beverages to lubricate our discussion and our time together here. Now, following this, we're going to have some live chit-chat, and as I have been saying quite a bit, that it is the interaction with fellow learners that is going into the future one of the few but very valuable things that schools can offer that cannot be replicated elsewhere. The interaction with live learners, and as Augustine himself will teach us in his own way today, and as schools, if they know what they're doing, will help us with, is to scaffold knowledge into a bigger picture. We have endless knowledge at our fingertips. That's really great. But it is the work of the academy and the work of ourselves as students to organize that, to organize the nearly infinite data that we have at our fingertips. So I guess we're putting ourselves into a certain picture there. But we're looking at historical cycles, and I'm going to bring up the screen share, and that'll assist us. So this week I was somewhat organized, and I have all sorts of tabs and notes and things. And they will hopefully come in handy. So, oh, we almost had it. Now where to go? So we'll have to hit this toggle here. There we go. Maybe, yeah. Okay, so indeed, this is our website. There is a sub-page with some helpful information, a doc site, as it's called, that you can go on and see some of the previous classes and so forth, and some of the material reference, especially the documents that we'll be looking at in this first introductory part. I will link some of the main ones in the description below, and you can find out everything else about Apokatastasis on our glorious page here, including, I'll make reference to this, as of this recording, it does happen to be the beginning of November. Speaking of cycles, it happens to be election day here in these United States, speaking of cycles. And this evening, we're going to have, this 4th of November evening, a look at Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy. We're talking about St. Augustine today, but I might mention a little bit about Boethius this class, as well as, if we don't get into it in this introductory section, certainly in our second stretch, setting up for next week, and that's Ibn Khaldun and his Muqaddimah, looking at his philosophy of history from an Islamic perspective. So we have all sorts of good things there. And here are our notes. So we've introed things. Now, our last class we began with, and you never teach a class except that you're always tweaking it for the next session. And I suppose the next time we'll run this, there will be a bit more about Herodotus and Pliny and some of the Roman and Greek historians, to say nothing of Persian historians and whatnot. But maybe not. And that is getting back to my point about Augustine, St. Augustine is a landmark figure in the West. And one need not be a Christian to appreciate the influence of this man, just like one not be a Muslim to appreciate the influence next week of Ibn Khaldun. And beyond Augustine's religious significance, and that's undeniable, because it's the 4th of November, we're within spitting distance of Reformation Day. In a sense, the Reformation in the 16th century was a giant explosion of Augustinian theology, left, right, and center, concerning grace and salvation and works, to say nothing of grace. Uh, and just liturgically in the Western office in the breviary, I don't think a week goes by that Augustine is not read in one of the lessons or one of the other lessons. So, yes, a titanic religious figure, but also a titanic intellect, regardless of creed. And for example, it's said that Augustine invents the autobiography. He's the first person to do that, to lay down his life story. And in preparing for class, I noticed a similarity, in fact, between his very famous book, The Confessions, his autobiography, and this focus of this class, the Civitas Dei, the city of God. And both of which, and this cannot be a mistake, both of which begin with, shall we say, topics near, and then they boomerang out into the theological, the philosophical, rather suddenly. So if you're familiar with the Confessions, the part that everyone reads is Augustine's meditation on his life and his boyhood, including with those pears. We can, if time allows, get back to those pesky pears and the story of the pears with Augustine. But in any case, in the Confessions, we read about the pears, we read about the rather severe-looking painting here, I thought. Whenever you don't want to get up in the morning, or you can't go exercise for today, or you can't give up the candy or the liquor or the coffee or whatever, you can just keep that image of Coach Augustine in your mind. You ain't putting up with nothing. You're getting out of bed. But yes, here's a painting of Augustine with the pears. What the hell is with the pears? But in any case, the similarity between the Confessions and today's focus, the city of God, is in the Confessions, to make a parallel, and we're going to need to make parallels today, because Augustine's contribution to historiography is, of course, it's going to be the last. Oh my goodness, where is the one I want? There we go. I'm going to put this at the end because this is the one I need to make the most reference to. Augustine's historiography makes a comparison of human life and the lifespan of the Roman Empire to the opening days, D-A-Y-S, the days of Genesis. These are called the 6 ages of the earth. And Augustine will use this to explain his historiography. In the Confessions, he begins with the story of his life, and then Augustine actually slingshots right into a meditation on the opening chapters of Genesis. And likewise, in the Confessions, Augustine rehashes in Book 1, or rather the first half, it's actually books 1 through 11 or something like that, the history of Rome. Augustine recaps everything, we'll say, from Romulus and Remus and Aeneas and the rape of the Sabines and Tarquin and all that stuff, all the way to his day. And his day was very heady indeed. The immediate events that cause Augustine to write the City of God are the sacking of Rome, and then the subsequent march of the Vandals through Spain and North Africa, where they will go on to plague the Mediterranean, as you can see in this helpful map. Lately gave another presentation, I mean, within the last week on the city of God, and it gets more into the nuts and bolts of it. And who was Marcellinus, who is the person the book's dedicated to. That was another event that caused Augustine to write the city of God. In fact, the opening, I think, 3 books are letters to Marcellinus, who was still alive when Augustine got going, and he was trying to make his apology or his argument why Rome converts to Christianity and then collapses. This shouldn't happen if Christianity is the true religion, as Augustine suggested. And then Marcellinus is killed by a mob and he's killed in palace intrigue. And that's an interesting story altogether. But that's another presentation I gave, which I will link below in the description. The point is, like the Confessions, the City of God begins with this rather lengthy recapping of Rome, and then it spins off into this more theological, philosophical meditation on the city of God and the city of man. And he takes this massive view of Roman life, which was and this synthesizing of Roman life into this single narrative, and then he applies it to larger human history. And this really is a new thing in terms of intellectual history. Now, we remember from last class, having set things up, that what I call Mediterranean Christianities, which we might call Catholicism and Orthodoxy today, are the merger of 2 worldviews. I just want to make sure everything's okay. That's fine. Everything's displaying as I wish. And so this is necessary to understand Augustine's historiography and a lot of, in fact, subsequent Western philosophy, theology, and historiography. And the simile that I use is that the skeleton of Mediterranean Christianity, the skeleton, what everything is hung on, are these Bible stories and Bible morality and the whole sweep of Bible history. That's the skeleton. And then what fleshes this out, like the muscles, like the flesh, is Hellenistic philosophy. And especially that idea of distinctions, and especially the idea, which you actually see in the New Testament, of the logos, the word, like in St. John's Gospel and epistles. Also in Hebrews, I think it's very difficult to understand the epistle to the Hebrews without understanding the Hellenistic idea of the world of forms, the heavenly tabernacle and all this stuff. So, there's already this blending. And this actually indicates, not to get off topic, but this blending indicates something that was happening to, we'll say, the Hebrew spiritual system. I'm hesitant to use the word Judaism, but the Hebrew spiritual system in the first century before Jesus Christ, Jesus of Nazareth, as you like. And that is, the split between Palestinian Hebrews, who were very anti-Hellenistic, and Alexandrian and Egyptian Hebrews, who were much more warm to that. And from the Bible, if you just want an example of this, compare 2 books which are written at about the same time. Compare the books 1 and 2 and 3, and I think there's actually more than that, but certainly 1 and 2 Maccabees. And then, which is, very much a snapshot of anti-Hellenic Hebrews. And then compare that to the Book of Wisdom, or the Book of Ben Sirach, which I think is sometimes called Ecclesiasticus, which is very nuanced and sublime philosophically. Those books are written in 2 different places, Palestine and Egypt, and they represent 2 different reactions to Hellenism. Rejection in the case of Maccabees and the Palestinians, Hebrews, and then an embrace in the case of the Egyptian ones. Shall we say, Hellenistic Hebrews become Christianity in a sense in this merger. Okay, now we said all that last class, and it's good to shake off the rust. With St. Augustine and his City of God, we see something else at play, and they all have embryos of the same thing, if you want that simile. They're all casting about in the same room, so to speak. They're putting their hands on the same reality, the Hellenistic in its way, the Hebraic, and this is new, the Roman. Uh, Augustine, in his own way, shares in various of these communities, religiously and civilly and philosophically. But with Augustine, we have the addition of this Roman worldview. What is it that they have in common? I underline here the word Roman. This isn't new, but it will also add, and this thing that they have in common will not just accent Augustine, it will accent really until this very day the Western worldview. Although it's very much secularized now, it continues. And that is a meta narrative, right? This is what Augustine brings, and this is what, in its own way, the Bible, the Hebraic system, the Hebraic vision, the Hellenistic and its world of forms, and the Roman and its legal system. This is what they all have in embryo. So again, just to slow down here, when it comes to the Hebraic, I'll try to keep my cursor where my mind is. When it comes to the Hebraic, you have this idea of progressive revelation of who this Yahweh God is from the time of Adam and Eve to the time of Micah and John the Baptist and Jesus and all of this. Is this idea of Yahweh progressively showing himself more and more and more nuanced, and also who is this entity dealing with? In the beginning, it's, I guess, Adam and Eve, and then Abraham and his people, and then the Hebrews. But then by the time you get to Isaiah and Jeremiah and Malachi and so forth, and then it explodes in the Christian period, this idea that this is for everyone, at least potentially. So that's at least in its baby form, present in the Hebraic system. What is it from Isaiah, I think, right? 10 men from every tribe in the world will grab hold of a Hebrew and say, "Let us go with you. God is with you." It's a great little image there. Okay, so that's this universal vision. This universal vision. Augustine will take this baby and rear it, if you like. Now, Augustine is not just sharing in the Hebraic tradition, in a sense, but also the Hellenistic. I just want to revisit that idea of the world of forms. We use the example of pens. You could use it whatever you want, chairs, mugs of tea that I'm keeping my hands warm with right now. There are many of these things all over the world. It's not just for the Greeks to have the logos. That this idea of transcendent reality, regardless of culture, greater than culture, greater than this material reality, right? The ultimate mug or chair or person, I suppose. I mean, that's where the Christians are going to take it with the logos and Jesus in their time, but the Muslims will take that and they say that's the Quran, right? That's the logos is the Quran. We'll get to that next week. But regardless, that's beyond the classical Greeks. The classical Greeks just had this idea of the perfect microphone, the perfect dog out there in this world of forms that transcended reality. So there is that aspect that Augustine brings to the table, and then finally, maybe less philosophical and maybe less exciting, but just as appropriate, is the Roman legal system. Boo, boo, boo. Yet there is a universal aspect to this, and this keeps popping up. I think it's Toynbee. When we get to Toynbee, he'll mention this. I do believe it's Toynbee. But this idea that keeps coming up in Western culture of a unified legal or government, world government, that is embryonic, we'll say, in the Roman legal system. Everyone theoretically can be conquered by Rome and can be grafted in to this. And Rome, all things being equal, was able to do this rather successfully. In a way that others hadn't. When I teach the Roman class, I argue that that is probably the most significant legacy of the Roman Empire. It's not the roads, which are cool, and it's not the gladiator stuff, which is cool and makes good movies, including sequels to Gladiator, I understand. But the biggest contribution, good or bad, we can debate, but certainly the most significant contribution is the Roman legal system, because it harnesses human energy more effectively than anyone had done before or since, which is why if you get into conspiracy land, you'll come across the question whether Rome ended. And that is a very good question, because maybe the armies are gone away, maybe, or maybe they're wearing different uniforms and have different weapons. But the vision, I'll tell you what doesn't go away in the West, is the vision of a single governing reality. And that means a civil governing reality and a single commercial reality that has existed before Augustine. Augustine will play with elements of that vision, and that will carry on in all sorts of strange ways after Augustine. But anyway, all of these three things come together in the city of God. And it is this universal aspect that begs us to ask, is Augustine the first medieval man? He's certainly one of the contenders. In fact, we have a little series. I mentioned Boethius next week. We have a little series going on. Augustine is first in this. I mean, you could chronologically, you could argue Augustine in the rather early period of the 5th century is the first medieval man. He's a monotheist. He has this universal vision of life, and so forth. He's also living at the end of the Roman Empire in the West. Boethius is, if you think if Augustine thinks the times are bad, he should hang on for Boethius. You talk about having a bad day. You could argue Muhammad and the Quran, and that time period in the 7th century is the beginning of the medieval period. And you could argue a little bit after that, the early times of Charlemagne and the Song of Roland times. That's the beginning of the medieval period. It's hard to lay down when these epochs begin, but there's clearly something definitive about this era, whether that's the 5th century or say the 8th century with the Song of Roland. There's something different about that epoch compared to, the time of Plato or Akhenaten before him in Egypt. So it's hard to put your finger on. It's like that old Supreme Court saying about Porto. I don't know what it is, but I know it when I see it. I don't know quite when a time period, to pirate that saying. I don't know when a new time period begins, but I know it when I see it. Okay. So again, getting back to the meta narrative. Meta means big. So the big narrative, the universal picture that comes together in Christianity, and in particular in Augustine. Okay. Something else that's proper to this text, and it's a text that was so precious that even in the medieval times, where it was very difficult to replicate books, Augustine's City of God is one of the most commonly reproduced texts. I've seen in New York City, which is having their election today. Maybe I should put some whiskey into this this flagon of tea. It'll calm me down depending on which way things go, but I'll behave myself. Regardless of electoral politics, in New York City, there are museums, and in some of these museums, you will see pages given from the illustrated manuscripts in medieval period of the Civitas Dei, and just a testament to how important this book was in the medieval era, right there next to the Bible in terms of length, but also in terms of replication. And you can go to the cloisters and things like that in the city and see other leaves from the book. Now, where there's a real development beyond just these more abstract historiographical points has to do with something from the 22nd chapter of the Civitas Dei, and that's called the Sex Aetates Mundi. So if you're a sixth grade boy, you can laugh as he said sex, as my Latin students have done endlessly whenever we go over numbers. But yes, this in Latin, it's the Sex Aetates Mundi, Aetates Mundi, the 6 ages of the world. And this is Augustine's parallel between the 6 days of creation. The 7th day is the day of rest, you'll recall from Sunday school. The 6 days of creation. And Augustine, we're going to read a section here and we'll see what he's talking about. Augustine will parallel these 6 days of creation with the 6 ages of what he would call the Old Testament church or ancient Israel. So the Old Testament, as Christians call it. And then later on, actually, in the medieval period, if you want, you should look this up. You can look it up. So pens out, who wants to learn. In the Reformation, there was a Catholic, I think it was a Jesuit, called, he was German, Bartholomew Holhauser. Bartholomew Holhauser, and he will develop this idea, and he will break up church history since the time of Christ and overlay it above the 6 ages of the church and the 6 ages of ancient Israel. And he'll see parallels there. So we might touch on him down the line because he kind of develops Augustine's idea. But in all of this, it's narrative. Augustine takes really what we see in embryo in the books of Kings and Chronicles, which is the interaction of Yahweh with ancient Israel in events in time. This is why in the Abrahamic conception of God, time is linear and history is linear, because in what becomes Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, God reveals himself progressively in concrete actions in time. In fact, a great deal of Christian infighting seems to be, and I suppose Islamic and Jewish infighting, seems to be completely ignorant of this point. The temporal, I might actually talk about that sometime because it might do some people a bit of good. This idea of the temporal interaction of God or the Holy Spirit or whatever in time. But that's for another time. What's appropriate here indeed is the 22nd chapter of the City of God. So I'm going to read this. And again, he's paralleling Genesis with later events in the Bible. And Augustine will take that and then apply it to Roman history in a unified fashion. And then in part 2 of the Civitas Dei is where he makes his conclusions. This part is in the setup. Okay. He says, 5 ages of the world accordingly have been now completed. And he argues that there has entered the 6th. Of these ages, the first is from the beginning of the human race, that is from Adam, who was the first man that was made, down to Noah. So he's paralleling the time of, let there be light, to the creation of Adam to Noah. So you can see the parallel that he's trying to lay out, who constructed the ark in the time of the flood. The second extends from the period of Abraham, who was called the father, indeed, of all the nations, which should follow after the example of his faith, but who at the same time, in the way of natural descent from his own flesh, was the father of the destined people of the Jews, which people, previous to the Gentiles into the Christian faith, was the one people among all the nations of all lands that worship the one true God, from which people Christ the Savior was decreed to come according to the flesh. For these turning points of those two ages occupy an eminent place in the ancient books. On the other hand, those of the other three ages are also declared in the gospel, where the descent of the Lord Jesus Christ, according to the flesh, is likewise mentioned. For the third age extends from Abraham on to David the king. The fourth age from David to that of the captivity, whereby the people of God pass it over into Babylonia. And the fifth age from the transmigration, coming back from Babylon, down to the advent of our Lord Jesus Christ. With his coming, the sixth age has entered on its process, so that now the spiritual grace, which in previous times was known to a few patriarchs and prophets, may be made manifest to all nations, to the intent that no man should worship God but freely, fondly desiring of him not the visible rewards of his services and the happiness of this present life, but that eternal life alone, in which he is to enjoy God himself, etc., etc. So he goes on here. Once again, this is chapter 22 from the Civitas Dei. The point we want is up here, right, where he parallels the creation of the world with the Old Testament, as Christians call it. And then, as I say, that will be developed later. There's one final point that's very present in Augustine, and this is necessary. And that's what we're going to call, and more importantly, what scholars and academics call the Deuteronomistic history. Did I dare? No, I didn't spell it right. But somehow it's one of the words on the what do you call it, Rolodex. Okay, so this is necessary to understand Augustine's thesis, especially in the second half of the Civitas Dei, and this will also affect subsequent Western perceptions, I think, rather dramatically. So deutero is a Greek word, it means number two, right? Protos, deuteros, and so forth. So Deuteronomy is a book in the Old Testament where it's the second law, as it's called. I think the Jews call it formally, I think they call the book of Deuteronomy the things passed over. And so those are collected apparently in this text. But to understand Deuteronomic history, which you can see affects other books in the Old Testament subsequently, especially Kings and Chronicles, Judith, Esther as well, Maccabees. To understand this, it's very simple, right? If you follow the law, which they mean the Mosaic law, you will be blessed. Now, that's pretty simple, right? In fact, if you read like Judges, you'll see this almost comically, this seesawing back and forth between a righteous judge and blessings given to the land, and then a wicked judge and invasion and defeat and humiliation and so forth. All of this goes back to Deuteronomy 28, by the way, which are the curses of the law, some of which are rather severe. Cannibalism in times of war, and humiliation on the battlefield. Interestingly, also inflammation. Inflammation is mentioned, and if you have any bouts of arthritis, you will understand why that is considered a curse. My rheumatoid arthritis has been behaving itself lately. It's amazing what happens when you don't eat late at night and when you don't drink alcohol late at night. It's amazing how your body blesses you and rewards you for being somewhat intelligent in your diet. I was hobbled up for much of the last 2 years because of my wicked non-Deuteronomistic eating habits at night. But anyway, Yeah, so Deuteronomy is where you're getting that, and so Augustine's going to take that to Roman history. Obviously, Augustine, as a Christian, does not hold to the Mosaic law, like the dietary stuff and all of that ritual aspect, but he does hold to the moral law, and that's going to be Augustine's final thesis. Why does Rome fall at the time that God should be blessing Rome for at least becoming warmer, if not openly supportive of the Christian church? And for the author, it's because Rome had, whatever its superficial acceptance of Christianity, Rome had lost its moral bearings. And conversely, why was Rome pagan for much of his history and yet seemingly blessed by God? Well, Augustine says that's because Rome was virtuous in its early years. In fact, that's why he lays out extensively in the beginning of Book One, he lays out early Roman history. He uses, for example, the example of Regulus. And God knows what'll come up if I do an image search, but you'll have to take my word for it. During the First Punic War, there was a consul called Regulus, who was like the president, basically, of Rome. And he was captured in battle by the Carthaginians. And at a certain point, the Carthaginians tried to use him as a pawn to go back to the Senate, groveling, crying, sniveling, and begging the Senate to make peace with Carthage. And the idea is that this is a sign of Carthage's power. If it's within their ability to send your president back on bended knee to you with a message from them, that's definitely a sign of dominance. And Regulus, he plays along until the time he gets into the Roman Senate. He's supposed to, be a stooge for the Carthaginians who had captured him. And then, Regulus stands upright in the Senate and then roars and demands that the Senate never surrender to Carthage. So it's definitely not what Carthage wanted to hear, from this little stunt they pulled. The point is, though, and this is what Augustine's saying, this is early Roman history. Regulus, after that, made a promise, right, that if he didn't do what the Carthaginians wanted, that he would turn himself in, and he did. He did not. He didn't have to go back to the Carthaginians, and he did. And of course, they were not very happy with little stunt that he pulled, and they killed him in a rather nasty way. There are different variations of it, but it seems they put him into a barrel with spikes on the inside and razor blades, and rolled him down a hill, and that was that. The point is, though, in a nutshell, for Augustine, God blesses Rome even though it's pagan because it's virtuous. And God damns Rome because even though now in his time it's Christian superficially, it's not virtuous. And that's his apologetic to why Rome is falling apart. But much more long-lasting for us in this class is the ages of the world concept, the meta-narrative concept. These will carry on, and indeed, the vision which exists Augustine, the vision of a unified world order, which in the West keeps cropping up, even at the time of Charlemagne with the Holy Roman Empire. Later on, in different ways with the British and the French and the Spanish and their empires, with the United Nations or NATO. This keeps coming up, rather secularized, but there it is. And it does pre-exist Augustine, but all of these come together in the city of God. Now, is there one more? Okay, we'll save that for the live stuff. I just want to read this, and then we'll take a little bit of a break here and come back for our seminar aspect. Okay. So I can't make this text any bigger, I'm afraid. Some of these websites, the margins work, some of them don't. I'm going to try one last time, make it super big, and sometimes that'll do the trick. Yeah, see, it only gives you like a sliver here. because the upper bar will have to make do with this. Okay, the 6 ages of the world, sex status mundi, sometimes the seven ages of the world, was a Christian historical periodization scheme first written about by St. Augustine. So he's the first one to really develop this. Now, there was something, make a note of this, there was something like this in Plato and his Republic. Plato did have this idea of previous ages to the world, the Golden Age, the Silver Age, and the Bronze Age. But what makes Plato's periodization different than Augustine's, and obviously Augustine was heavily influenced, maybe too influenced if you're an Orthodox Christian, lowercase o, um, uh, maybe too influenced by Plato, because Augustine, I mean, he had a very hard time uh, accepting elements of Christianity because of his Platonism. And his Platonic assumption that the immaterial was more important than the material, which is why if you get a little bit deep into Augustine, you'll notice he has quite a hang up, as good Platonists would. He has quite a hang up with the sexual act, and that has very unpleasant ramifications in later Christian history. That is to say, how can you have this act that creates a human being, but puts them in a human body that's full of lust and lusts of all sorts, not just the erotic. So Augustine is very influenced by Plato. He obviously gets periodization from Plato in any case, but where he differs very much from Plato is that his periodization, though we might say it's based on where is he? There we go. It's based, we'll say, on the Hebraic mythology, not the Greek mythology. Again, mythos does not mean a made-up story. I'm not commenting on that one way or another. But where Augustine is different is he plugs all of this into Roman history, into concrete events in documented time, whereas Plato, he's talking about basically a time before time, the time of the gods and the Golden Age, and then the time of the Titans in the Silver Age, and now the time of man in the Bronze Age. And Plato might talk about things like Atlantis, but despite some very cool documentaries, the hunt is still very much on, right? When you're dealing with Plato, it's much more abstract, which shouldn't be a surprise given the world of forms, right? With Augustine, it's more concrete. And that's really the development that he brings to philosophy and to history, coming together with different of those themes. Augustine's scheme was based, quote, upon Christian religious events from the creation of Adam to the events of Revelation. The 6 ages of history, which last approximately for Augustine 1,000 years, were widely believed in and used throughout the Middle Ages. Interestingly, so was Virgil. Virgil had, again, very much more Platonic-like meditations on human history. But if you're familiar with the Eclogues, those were also very much almost taken as pagan prophecy, historically speaking, during the medieval period. Virgil was kind of considered not very far away from a divine prophet, because of the Eclogues and because of his virtue as well in the Aeneid, for instance. Anyway, and until the Enlightenment, the writing of history was mostly the filling out of all or some part of this outline. So up until the 18th century, these 6 ages of the world were the way that people framed history. Just like now in the 21st century, we use, even ignorantly, we don't know where this comes from, but it's how we've all were taught, right? The ancient world, the medieval world, the modern world, right? Where did that come from? That came from the Enlightenment. Nothing wrong with that, nothing bad with that, whatever, nothing good with that. It is what it is. But the point is, Augustine's 6 ages of the world, had that kind of framework for actually a much, much longer period of time. We'll say from the 5th century to the 18th century, so 1300 years. The outline accounts for 7 ages, just at their 7 days of the week, with the 7th age being the eternal rest after the final judgment. And the end times, just as the 7th day of the week is reserved for rest. It was normally called the 6 ages of the world because in Augustine's scheme, there were the ages of the world of history, while the 7th age was not of this world, but as Bede the Venerable later elaborated, it ran parallel to the 6 ages of the world. So it's this divine age. It's this time beyond time. And getting into Christian numerology, you have the number 8. The number 8 in Christian numerology it means infinity. There's 8 hours to the divine office. There are 8 beatitudes and so forth. So anyway, it ran parallel. The Sunday in Christian liturgy is considered the 8th day. It's the time beyond time. It's the time outside of time, which is why people used to work or do things on Sunday, because they were no longer living on this earth, in a sense, on Sunday. When I was a boy, nothing was open in town. And then even in the 1990s and in secular Connecticut, things were not open, because that was a legacy of that idea of Sunday being the time outside of time. Okay. Augustine was not the first to conceive of the 6 ages, which has its roots in Jewish tradition, of course, from Genesis, but he was the first Christian to write about it. And as his ideas became the central to the church, so did his authority. As I say, it's hard to exaggerate Augustine's place, at least in Western Christianity. Okay, so they say the Bible citation is from Peter's epistle, second epistle. The interpretation was taken to mean that mankind would live through 6 1,000-year periods or days, with the 7th being the eternity in heaven, according to the Nicene Creed, a world to come. And I'll finish up here and we'll take a little break. Medieval Christian scholars believed it was possible to determine the overall time of human history, starting with Adam, by counting forward how long each generation had lived up to the time of Jesus, based upon the ages recorded in the Bible. While the exact age of the earth was a matter of biblical interpretive debate, it was generally agreed that man was somewhere in the last and final 1,000 years of the 6th age, and the final 7th age could happen at any time. The world was seen as an old place. The future would be much shorter than the past. A common image was of the world growing old. Okay. And I should just leave off with one thing. I do beg your pardon for not bringing this up, but this is a good place actually to leave off. Whether it's so-called pagan, Christian, Jewish, Islamic, it doesn't matter. How should I say? Here we go. Ripples in a pond. I want an appropriate image here. I do not trust even Google Images to do a cold search. I will say this, if I haven't said it before, that you do tend to get more family-friendly images on Google, whatever drawbacks the platform has otherwise, compared to Yandex or Bing. And on those platforms, you're almost guaranteed some sort of pornographic query, no matter how innocent it is. So it's one extreme or the other. You either get something that's completely censored in good ways and bad with Google, or you get something that's completely uncensored, but you get some rough stuff as well. Okay, anyway, this is very important to understand a lot of things about the world. I would say any time before the Enlightenment, in any culture before the Enlightenment, is this concept. And we see a rock that's plopped into a lake or some body of water. There are many differences between Abrahamistic visions of life and so-called pagan visions, but where they're all in unity, East and West, Chinaman, Hindu man, as much as we know of the American Indians in North and South, certainly different cultures in the Mediterranean and Near East, they all basically have this in common up until the Enlightenment, and that is the idea that sometime in the past was better. Meaning all of these what are called pre-modern cultures, pre-Enlightenment cultures, they are not like we are. They are not looking into the future for more knowledge. They are looking to the past. That is one of the biggest demarcations, not just between the ancient world and the medieval and the Western context, but between the modern and the pre-modern. A pre-modern person, pagan, Christian, or Jew, and all these other peoples, and us, um, this is one of the biggest differences, is that all of them were looking backwards to a golden age or to some time of revelation when the Quran was sent down, when Jesus came, when Moses was on the mountain, when Aeneas founded Rome, when there was this world of forms before matter. Whatever that time was, specifically the cultures would differ, the Kali Yugas and all this stuff with the Indians. The point is the perfection was in the past, and everything since then was a total ripple away from this. And every year and every second was a time farther away from this time of revelation. Now, the Christians, the Muslims, and the Jews, the so-called Abrahamic religions, they brought a revolution to this because they did see an end to history, but they still had this prejudice of, the ultimate source of knowledge was sometime in the past, and in the scholars and thinkers and saints and books of the past. And there's a huge revolution that happens at the time of Newton, and I'll save you that lecture, why the apple falling on Newton's head. I'll save that for when we get to Giambattista Vico and we get to more modern ways of understanding history. But I've jabbered on plenty, so I'm going to end this introductory class recording and just check up on who's standing, if anyone's still standing, and then we'll go from there. If you're watching this on the video channels, please check out the description down below, and you can see some of the articles. You can just click on the links and head over. And then you can head over to Apocatastasis and sign up for all of our courses. All right. So for you watching on the video sites, thank you and sayonara.